This is a presentation of some photos I took while doing field work in northern India a few summers ago. You've seen my slides for Hinduism, and these slides will focus on Buddhism and the Buddhist holy sites that I visited. I stayed in a guest house in actually a colony established by Tibetans that had fled Tibet because of the Chinese occupation. In this next slide, you're going to see one of these Tibetans, a monk who was actually nice enough to sit with me. He didn't speak English, and I had a translator that worked with us, but it was a pretty fascinating discussion. One of the things that struck me is that he didn't really make much of a distinction between the three sects of Buddhism. It's almost as if this is something that's important to scholars of religion, like myself, but not so much to actual practicing Buddhist, even though, of course, he's a Tibetan Buddhist, which means his sect would be Vajrayana Buddhism. This is a sign welcoming people to the Deer Park, where the Buddha taught his first sermon on the Four Noble Truths that we discussed in an earlier module. It was called Sarnath, still called Sarnath. It's north of Varanasi, the Hindu holy site that we visited in the Hindu presentation. And you can see they're calling it the birthplace of Buddhism because, of course, this is where he taught his first sermon on the Four Noble Truths. In this next photo, you see a depiction of the Buddha sitting and teaching his first sermon on the Four Noble Truths to his five disciples, his first five disciples, who would all then themselves go on to teach and spread the teachings of Buddhism. Here you see the actual sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which means the first turning of the wheel of the teaching of the Buddha. Sutta means scripture. And on the left, you see it translated in Pali, on the right in English. This is a stupa that actually marks this spot we were just looking at, where the Buddha taught his first sermon. A stupa is a stone enclosure that houses relics of the Buddha. Here you see the foundation of the stupa, and as you can see, it dates back to 200 BCE, so quite ancient. Here's a little plate just describing the goings-on at Sarnath and some information about the archaeology. Certainly you can stop the presentation and read it if you'd like. Lots of good information here about the site and some of the work that's been done here. Here's a plate that describes a stupa, not the one we saw a while ago, but another one on the site, built by King Asoka. King Asoka reigned in the 3rd century BCE, and it is said that after a really bloody battle, he pretty much swore off violence and embraced ahimsa, nonviolence, and the teachings of the Buddha. And for the rest of his life, for the last 40 years or so of his life, he dedicated himself to nonviolence, loving compassion, and spreading the teachings of the Buddha. In fact, he dispatched his son and his daughter to Sri Lanka, which was the first place that Buddhism spread to. And Asoka erected pillars, stone pillars, all over India describing various things about the Buddha, sometimes just rulings or edicts of Asoka, sometimes devotional sayings can be found on these pillars. Here's one you see here at Sarnath that I was able to get a photo of. And because of these pillars, we actually know a lot about the Buddha and the actual spots where things were taking place in the life of the Buddha. Here you can see a close-up of one of these pillars and the inscriptions on it. They were written probably in the language called Magadhi and something called Brahmi script, a very ancient Indian script. Okay, now we're moving to Bodh Gaya. Here's a little play on words, Buddha Gaya. The actual town is Bodh Gaya, Bodhgaya. And this is where the Buddha attained enlightenment. And you can see 2,550 years of Mahaparinibbana. That just means the great final nirvana of the Buddha. This statue is a little bit over 80 feet tall. It was dedicated in 1989. A number of dignitaries from Buddhist countries were on hand, including the Dalai Lama, and he consecrated the statue in 1989. Virtually all Buddhist countries have built temples or monasteries in Bodh Gaya, and here is the Bhutanese temple. This is inside the temple. Typically, you walk inside the temple, and front and center will be a statue of the Buddha right in front of you. And here's what you see inside the Bhutanese temple. Here is the Tibetan temple that was built in Bodh Gaya. There were actually 2 Tibetan temples and 1 monastery in Bodh Gaya. This is what it looks like inside the Tibetan temple. As long as you take your shoes off and you're quiet and you behave yourself, you can walk right in, take photos, and you're welcome. This is a really incredible stupa that was built outside one of the Tibetan temples. And here's what it looks like. Quite amazing. You see prayer flags there floating in the breeze. Tibetans write scriptures on these flags, and as the breeze blows them, it's as if they're being said for all the souls of the world. So prayer flags, very much a Tibetan Buddhist thing. And the Kadam Stupa. Here's the Japanese temple. It was probably the most elegant of all the temples. So the Japanese Buddhist temple. Of course, in Japan, you find Zen Buddhism. This is what it looks like inside the Japanese temple. Again, understated, kind of elegant. There's a really interesting series of murals that depicted scenes from the life of the Buddha inside the Japanese temple. Here you see his virgin birth. Here he is as a young boy, surrounded by the so-called nurse maidens. Here he is at 29 when he's leaving his home and his family, the so-called going forth. And here he is in his emaciated state near death when Kujata, sometimes called Sujata, nursed him back to health. And then finally, of course, sitting under the Bodhi tree, having attained enlightenment. Here's the other Tibetan temple in Bodh Gaya that I visited, a little bit larger than the other one. It's also a monastery. And here's what it looks like inside the temple. This is Maitreya Buddha. This is a Buddha that is to come in the future. So it is said that eventually the Dharma of the original Buddha will be forgotten, and Maitreya Buddha will come to give us the Dharma or the teachings once again. Here's a huge prayer wheel. It's about 10 feet in diameter inside the Tibetan temple. Here's a monk who was kind enough to stop his consultation for just a second or two. Let me take a picture of him. This is Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Bodhisattva means something like a celestial Buddha. And it is said that the Dalai Lama, or all 14 of them, including the current one, are actually manifestations of this particular Bodhisattva. And here is another shot of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. Here's the Thai temple in Bodh Gaya, very elaborate, amazing looking. Here's the Vietnamese temple, and obviously each temple reflects the architectural styles of the country that it derives from. This is looking across the river where supposedly the Buddha crossed it some 2,500 years ago to reach the Bodhi tree. Here's a small shrine that's devoted to that event where the Buddha was nursed back to health by Sujata. And there's a little depiction of the Buddha in an emaciated state. And right beyond that little white structure is the actual stream where Siddhartha fainted and was nursed back to health. I actually retraced his steps from there to the Bodhi tree. And here we are at the great temple Of course, you remove your shoes. And here's the Mahabodhi Mahavihara Temple, which means something like the Great Enlightenment Great Temple, Great Monastery. And it marks the spot where the Buddha was enlightened. They were doing some work on it when I was visiting, so hence the scaffolding that you see. And again, not surprisingly, King Asoka was the one who pretty much started the building of the temple in the 3rd century BCE. This is what it looks like inside the Sanctum Sanctorum, the holiest of holies of the temple. There's an elaborate golden statue of the Buddha. And here's the Bodhi tree, or at least one of its biological relatives. Supposedly they have grafted pieces of the original tree to keep it alive. And this is what it looks like at pretty much the spot where the Buddha sat some 2,500 years ago. And on the very spot where the Buddha sat, there's a piece of sandstone on top of which they've placed this elaborate diamond throne. And I've stuck my camera through the brass bars that sort of enclose it to give you a shot of it. After the Buddha was enlightened, he spent a certain amount of time in several spots around the tree, and these slides that you'll be seeing all tell you something about what he was doing at the spots and also mark these spots. Here you see he spent the 3rd week walking up and down in meditation, and this is a symbolic rendering of the footsteps of the Buddha, supposedly where he walked. Lotus flowers bloomed. Here's another site where he spent some time. Here, the 5th week was spent under this tree in meditation, and this marks the spot where that occurred. And here he spent the 6th week, and supposedly during a rainstorm, a huge cobra actually came out and gave him protection from the rain, according to the scriptures. And here's a depiction of that. And here's where he spent his 7th week, and a description of what was going on at that time. And this is the actual spot. Another Asokan pillar that you find on the site with inscriptions on it. And here you see the ancient stone railing that still stands. It was built over 2,000 years ago that surrounds the temple. And in the last slide I have a close-up of an inscription on the railing, probably written in ancient Sanskrit or something close to what we see on the Asokan pillars.